Welcome back, everyone. It's good to have you here. So in today's video, I wanted to go over 3 habits for landscape photography that I've been using over the last decade as a full-time landscape photographer. And without these habits, I don't think that I would have improved as quickly, and I definitely wouldn't have had as much of a good time while shooting and creating images. So the number one habit that I always used to make the mistake with and never do, but really changed the way I take photos and really helped me to improve much quicker, is to stop constantly trying to learn new techniques. And what I always see when I'm teaching people, and what I always did in the past myself, is you learn photography just in the beginning or your intermediate. So you have all these techniques you could learn online. There's tons of free, great material. But you see all these awesome advanced techniques and you don't really take the time, or I guess I should say I didn't really take the time to learn all the underlying fundamental techniques and really become an expert at them. And by fundamental techniques, I mean things like when you pick up your camera and you use it, do you have a step-by-step process that you go through every time when setting up for an image and creating the image? So by having a fundamental step-by-step process, say you set up the composition, you dial in your f-stop, shutter speed, whatever else, having this workflow or process in place where you really understand why you're choosing each specific setting can be extremely helpful. And what I found when learning is that I didn't understand the step-by-step process. I hadn't created one for myself. So I hadn't really shot, or I hadn't really thought through the image creation technique that I wanted to use while out in the field. So since I hadn't thought through that technique, every time I went out to shoot, my brain was just going everywhere, like, what should I do now? What should I do now? But when you have this step-by-step underlying process that you can follow, your subconscious eventually takes over once you memorize this process, and then you can really concentrate on the two things that really matter. And that is finding the best light for landscape photography and finding the best composition. And these are both things that take creativity, whereas selecting your best camera settings, it's not really a creative thing once you learn the basics of it. So that's the biggest thing that I learned to do as a habit, is before I learn any advanced or intermediate techniques, I always make sure that I'm an absolute expert at the underlying techniques. So by expert, what I mean is, can you visualize the entire image creation process of photons coming through the front of your lens, going through an aperture, hitting an image sensor? What happens when they start to fill the pixel wells in that image sensor? What happens when that signal is relayed into the camera? How does exposure work? And how does color and light work within the camera, depending on your type of camera? So if you can visualize all this stuff, you won't really ever be wondering what settings you should choose. And if you have a step-by-step process in place to help you select these settings, along with this expert knowledge of the underlying settings, then you're never going to be questioning yourself, and you'll have a very clear mind while out shooting to be creative. So that applies to camera technique, it applies to photo editing, and it applies to anything else that you're doing in photography that's not creative, meaning you don't have to think up new things on the fly. Any repetitive task in photography, and there are many of them, you should create your own process, and instead of wondering what you should do, next time you're going through that process, you'll have thought through each step as you wrote them out and memorized them for yourself, and they'll make logical sense. So you will no longer have to worry, and 100% of your time can be spent doing the creative stuff, like finding good light and finding really good creative compositions. So that's the number one thing. Don't try to learn the expert stuff until you're a master at the fundamentals. And it takes a while to do that. And it can be boring unless you really become a student of it. And you say, well, I want to be great at photography, so I need to learn everything about how my camera works. So that kind of ties in to the second habit that I think is essential if you want to improve quickly and you want to create the best images. And the second habit is, don't look for new camera gear all the time, and keep your camera gear as simple as possible. So by as simple as possible, I mean just get the tools that you need to get the job done. For example, I have one camera, and then I have 2 lenses. I have a 14 to 30 millimeter, and then I have a 24 to 200 millimeter. So for landscape photographers, they might be thinking, well, I want a 300 millimeter. Well, how I get away with this is if you get a larger megapixel count camera, such as the Z7 that I'm making this video on, or D810, D850, any other pretty large megapixel count camera, I can crop down a 200 millimeter shot in digital post-processing to 300 millimeters. So instead of buying a 300 millimeter lens and having to worry about this huge lens to carry around, you can make do with the current equipment you have. And then once you find out that that equipment is actually holding you back, and to find out it's holding you back, you have to be an expert at all the foundational stuff. But once you find that your current equipment is holding you back, then look to upgrade. And whenever I'm upgrading equipment, I will buy the best thing that I can get my hands on, and you could just look for the best thing you can currently afford. If you can afford whatever, then get the best camera and lens setup you can afford and that you need for the job. And by doing that, you won't have to watch the current trends for all this new gear that constantly comes out. When I buy a new camera, I'll research it for about a week to see what I want, and then I'll get the new camera. Lenses last forever, so unless you're upgrading from DSLR to mirrorless, you don't need new lenses. But once you have that new camera, you learn it, and then you can just keep it for 5 to 8 years, depending on how much you shoot. And it's a really good camera, and at this point in technology, there's no need to upgrade all the time. Just get the best you can afford, and then stick with it for 5 to 8 years until it's actually holding you back or the camera's starting to fall apart or deteriorate. And the essential part of this is that when you get new gear, or when you're researching new gear, it takes up all these mental cycles, and learning a new camera, even if you're already good at photography, just takes a whole lot of time until it's actually becomes like part of your hand again, where you don't have to think about the camera being there, and you can just think about creating images, and your hand just automatically, subconsciously moves to the buttons on the camera. So it just takes so much time to learn new techniques and new gear for new equipment that anytime you spend doing that, you can't spend creating. So always looking for new gear is going to really drag you back in the ability to improve your actual photography. So get the best gear you can afford. After you have it, learn it, become an absolute expert at the tools you need for that equipment and the tools you need for the fundamental foundations of the skills you need, like camera technique, photo editing. But don't try to add all this extra equipment on. Keep it as minimal as possible. The same goes with photo editing. Just keep everything minimal until you find yourself running into the wall, and the wall comes from knowing you're an expert and you've run out of the tools required, and then look to upgrade. So that's something that's really helped me out, because I'm never looking for the latest and greatest gear. I'm looking to constantly shoot and constantly improve my photo editing and constantly be out in the field working on images, because that's where the real learning takes place. You can watch YouTube videos 24/7 and they can be a great learning tool, but if you're always watching videos and never shooting, or always watching for the latest gear and never practicing with your gear, there's no way you'll get better. And the people that are out actually practicing are going to get better very rapidly, because they're constantly failing, they're constantly learning how their equipment works, they're optimizing their whole process, they're having step-by-step routines ingrained in their subconscious, and then they can really practice on the stuff that matters. That is composition and the light on the landscape and making the best photos out of that. All the rest of the stuff is just tools, right? If you could just look at a scene and capture the image through your eye without a camera, and it would be the perfect settings, you just wouldn't use a camera. So a camera is just a tool. We need to be experts at it, but keep it minimal as possible. So the last habit that I used to fail with all the time as well, and that really changed the level of my photography more than even the first two habits, is that when you're planning photography trips, depending on how you do it, I'm doing this professionally full time, so I can really watch the best weather trends to hit spots at the perfect time. And often I'll go out backpacking for 10 to 15 days, and that lets me to be out with the weather, so I can guarantee good shots. But when I wasn't doing it full time, and I was just going out on weekends or weeknights or going on vacation to shoot, I would look at the weather report, and this was when I was just starting out, and it would say really bad weather, like rain or really bad storms, so I would stay inside. And then one day I was like, well, why don't you just go out and try anyway? Because the weather report is an educated guess, basically. Nobody knows the weather exactly. And I just started looking at the weather real quickly to see what it would be like, so I could have the right gear if I needed it. But other than that, I would go out no matter what the weather was. If it was rainy, if it was snowy, if it was stormy. And what I found, that oftentimes that weather report was close, but it was completely incorrect at certain times of the day, meaning it might be raining, but then sun would break through on the horizon and there'd be rainbows, or there'd be really cool clouds rolling through. And some of the best photos I've ever taken were on times that I went out, even though the weather report looked like it was going to be bad. and it just turned out being an awesome photography trip. And worst case scenario, you just get wet and cold, and as long as you have the right warm gear and you can stay safe, then it's just feeling, and you get some really cool photos out of it. And I know the backpacking and landscape photography trips that I've been out on, where the weather's been wild, meaning constant dynamic weather rolling through, rain, snow, storms, freezing rain, that's where the best photos come out of. So looking for nice weather or comfortable weather is often going to not produce the best photos for you. So just get used to going out in the worst of weather and ease your way into it in a way that it's not dangerous. But that's where all the good shots and the good light come out of. So hopefully you guys enjoyed those 3 little habits. I make those a part of my life. So whenever I'm asking myself if I'm going to learn something new, I say, well, are you willing to spend all the time to become an expert at the fundamentals first before you get to all the stuff that looks really cool, like all the advanced techniques? And if I'm not extremely excited to learn all the fundamentals and to become an expert at them, then I'm not going to go on with the rest of it. I have to be willing to dedicate the time to get through the beginner stuff, which doesn't seem that exciting. It can be, but it doesn't seem like it as exciting. But once you know it, everything else beyond it just gets way better because you have a really strong foundation of knowledge and you don't have to question yourself so much. And when you have this strong foundation of knowledge and you also trust in yourself to make the right decisions, even though they'll be wrong sometime, having that trust in yourself while out taking photos just can make a way better experience as far as enjoyment, and it also creates way better photos as well. So thanks for watching the video, guys. Hopefully you got something out of it. These are just things that I've learned from failing a whole lot and constantly trying to progress my photography forward as I continue to do now. So I'll always be trying to learn and let you guys know what I learn in the paths that I take. So thanks for watching. See you next time.